So welcome. It's my great pleasure to be here with Jen Rexford. She's one of the leading figures in computer networking today. She's had an amazing career, really shaping much of the modern research agenda in networking, both in industry and now in academia, making foundational contributions to a bunch of topics, including routing and network management, software-defined networking, cellular networks. Just a little bit of history for those who don't know Jen. She started her career after grad school at AT&T Labs, where she got to work on real-world problems at a massive scale, and then later moved to Princeton, where she's actually an alumna, and set up a research group there, which is one of the really active groups in the networking community for the past about 20 years. People may not realize because Jen has continued to be active in research. She even published at SIGCOMM this year, but she's actually taken on major administrative roles at Princeton for about the past decade. She served 7 years as Princeton's department chair in CS, which is a big job. And then a couple years ago, stepped into the provost role. That's the chief academic and budget officer for the entire university. So this is a big job, and it's in the US a really important time for higher education. So it's wonderful to have people like Jen who are so talented and willing to spend their time serving in these roles. And then lastly, this is special for me because Jen and I have a personal connection. I did not start my career in networking. I was a programming languages PhD. Did a postdoc with Jen in 2009, along with Dave Walker. And it's no exaggeration to say working with Jen is the reason I'm still in networking today. We had a great time collaborating on a bunch of early work on SDN, also more recently on the Pronto project, looking at cellular networks. And it's been really fun thinking about networking problems with Jen and learning how to be a researcher in this field. So what I want to do with this interview is kind of take a high-level view of kind of research and networking. This is very much in the spirit of NINES. NINES is a conference dedicated to thinking a little bit further over the horizon, maybe than ordinary research that we do day to day. So I thought I'd start though by looking backwards. I love origin stories, and ask, how did you first get into networking? What made you choose to make your career in this field?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thanks so much for doing this interview with me. It's a real pleasure. So many of us, like yourself, didn't start in networking. And in my case, I was in parallel computing, which was a hot topic when I went to grad school in the early 90s. And the web exploded on the scene about halfway through grad school. And one of the things I had found frustrating in my work on parallel computing was not having any measurement data, not having the kind of workloads that would drive the kind of design decisions I was trying to make or the simulations I wanted to do. And all of a sudden, here was this huge network, like a parallel computer writ large, global in scale, where I could actually get that kind of data. And also the applications were coming fast and furious. It was just an amazing opportunity to have access to something much more real than what was animating the work I was doing. So I thought I would pick better problems to work on if I had a real system to look at. And also, I've always been really interested in computer science for the way it lowers the barriers for who gets to innovate. In terms of, if you can write code, you get to innovate. And the internet was, again, that writ large, where people could create content or create applications and all of a sudden have an international platform for them. So I found that aspect of the internet exciting too.
Cool. So as I mentioned, you started your career at AT&T Labs. And it was before my time as a sort of professional researcher, but I gather that was a very special place. Just the sort of freedom to explore problems, the connection to this giant company that was running one of the largest, if not the largest, networks at the time, and just being able to sort of work across disciplines. Can you tell us a bit about like what that was like? Like you show up on day one, what you're showing your office, like what was that like when you were starting out?
Yeah, well, two things were really influential for me. Actually, Radia Perlman came to AT&T to give a talk very early, one of my first or second month at AT&T, and gave a talk on internet routing, which is something I knew nothing about at the time because I'd done all this work on parallel computing, focusing on routing, but it's very different to do routing in a toroidal mesh than to do it in the internet. And she just talked about all these really intriguing and complicated and bizarre things that go on in routing that I was just hooked. So I would say Radia had a big influence on what area of networking I chose to dive into when I got to AT&T. But the second was just the way the group I was in, Albert Greenberg ran, that really connected mathematicians and theorists and people doing optimization with people that were doing the actual day-to-day running of the network. And it was early in AT&T's time, and AT&T was a little late to the internet game. And in a way, that was a blessing for us because we were able to be there and help as they were getting their first IP network commercial services off the ground.
So it sounds like you spent time with like operators and practitioners. Did you kind of roll up your sleeves and go dive in and look for problems, or were you sitting in your office, working on writing sitcom papers?
It was definitely dive in and look for problems. And I think at the beginning, we really wanted to collect measurement data. And that was the thing that had excited me, as I mentioned earlier. And want to be able to kind of get the support to deploy measurement devices. We were looking for things, okay, if we have this data, we can answer this question for you. So some of it was a little bit of a quid pro quo. And it's like, okay, we can help you if you help us. But some of it was like, hey, actually the things they need are really interesting. And as I started to watch what they were doing and learn more about what they were doing, I found all sorts of fun and interesting research problems that that needed to be sharpened and formulated and iterated on. But I found that my matchmaking role of helping the network operators identify problems to sharpen them enough that I could go to the optimization person or the algorithm person. I might not have the skill to solve the problem we ended up with because it was a very problem first approach. It wasn't clear when I went in that the problems would be the ones I'd be equipped to solve, but I might be equipped to help in formulating them.
And so I assume these problems you're talking about, this is like your work on traffic engineering at the time, or yeah.
Yeah,
Can
it's
you tell
project
us a little bit more about how that project evolved and how you shaped it?
Yeah, so at the beginning, we first started just on helping the network administrators find configuration mistakes. That was something Anya Feldman started working on, and I joined in as well, looking at the configuration data. And half of the things we found that were strange in the data were just us learning we were wrong, like, oh, they were there for a reason we just didn't understand, and that helped us learn. And the other half were things that were actual mistakes. And so there became this nice symbiotic relationship where the network operators were helping us learn by correcting the things we didn't understand, and we were helping them by finding mistakes that they needed to fix. And then eventually we realized, gosh, now we know the network topology, we know the network routing configuration, we can actually start helping them change the configuration. And gee, to do that, we need to know the offered traffic. And so it was kind of step by step, we realized we needed to know the topology, the traffic, and then we could start helping them optimize. So it really was a very bottom up kind of organic approach where each step offered insight and tools to them and learning for us. And then by the end, we had a bit of a closed loop management system that helped them measure, analyze, and control aspects of the network.
So I assume this line of work also led into sort of the proto software-defined networking architectures that you started to play with, and some of these
Yeah.
ideas about sort of thinking about these problems in a more, I don't know, top-down way. Um, you've written a paper with Ellen Zagura and Nick Feimster about the sort of intellectual history of SDN. Was it obvious to you at the time that you were kind of on this path that was going to rethink the whole architecture and the way these algorithms were implemented, or was it more just, we're trying to solve a problem right now in the wider network, and here's what we need to do?
Yeah, it was very organic. I think we had a moment where we felt, gosh, we're making all these network management tools and the protocols are making it awfully difficult. Like we're bending over backwards to coax the network into doing what we wanted by tweaking whatever configuration parameters happened to be there that weren't really designed to be used in this way. And so we were getting more and more worried that the complicated network software that was in the routers was getting complemented by complicated software we were writing to coax the router into doing our bidding. And then one of my colleagues who worked on telephony networks told me about what had happened in the phone network was the creation of a network control point that was a centralized piece of software that helped with some of the control plane of the phone network. And I read this paper. A lot of times these bellheads would tell us stories about how much better it was in the phone network, and we would just be like, oh yeah, okay, it's there they go again. They don't understand the internet. And then I read these old papers from the 80s in the Bell Labs Technical Journal about that transformation in the phone network. And I was like, gosh, that's actually not a bad idea for us. It's like, it was so cute. It was like you could use a single stored program computer. That was even the language they used to control an entire network. And that got us thinking, like in the internet context, maybe that would be a centralized routing platform. And that got us thinking about, gee, maybe we could do that. But it was almost, to be honest, we were almost a little apologetic about it. It's like, well, we have to do this because we're not allowed to change the code on the routers. We have to do this because it's getting too complicated. It was more like born out of desperation. So there was a moment of inspiration in it that came from this hint by a colleague, but some of it was just desperation because we were getting so frustrated and everything was so darn complicated. And then Hui Zhang came on sabbatical from CMU, and he's like, "Wow, maybe you would do this even if you didn't have to. Like maybe this is actually a good idea." And that was an epiphany too, because we were so locked into the, being pragmatic and solving a problem that we didn't actually think it made sense necessarily. And then he helped us think, actually, maybe this is just the right way to do things.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think sometimes people think, research vision is sort of you sit by yourself for a long time and sort of ponder and, come up with the brilliant direction. But your method, and I think many other people, it's really rooted in problems and experience. And
Yeah.
there's like a generalization, there's a step, these kind of tips from a colleague or way coming from CMU where, yeah, someone realizes, oh, I can kind of up level this, but it's still grounded in solving a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I love the time that you spend at Princeton during your postdoc because you just spend a lot of time trying to write programs on what was it Knox, the Knox very early Knox controller, and it's just like, wow, this is way too hard, and this is the thing I'm doing over and over again that should be easy, right? I think abstraction's born out of pain, right? Where you do something over and over again, you're like, gosh, this one thing would actually unlock a lot.
Yeah, I think something else, I think you're referring to my postdoc year. You may not know this, but I was super stressed out at the time, and I shouldn't have been because I had my job, my faculty job was already lined up. I deferred my start date, so I didn't have the usual postdoc stress of like, I need to then, go interview and get a job. Um, but I think we get so caught up sometimes with, paper cycles and you look at your peers and they're publishing papers. And when you're starting something in a new area or something more significant, you kind of have to give yourself the space to explore and do that. And yeah, that at the time that was very stressful. Like just yeah, all those days writing, writing code and kind of discovering problems. But often those investments, pay off.
Yeah, I felt the same way my first 3 years at AT&T. I published almost nothing because I mean I was working in parallel computing. I didn't even know TCP or I didn't know anything about networking really. And so I spent so much time learning and learning the operational stuff takes even longer because there's just operational practice that's not in any book. You're reading config files, right? I mean, it's sort of similar to writing code in Knox. So I spent a lot of time not being particularly productive, partially because I had a steep learning curve to get up, and partially because I didn't have any related work on what I was trying to do that was there to kind of help with that.
So I want to maybe move past AT&T. So I guess lots of people left AT&T around the time that you did. There were some economic changes, I think, that were causing people to look elsewhere. And you chose instead of going to another company, another research lab, to go back to a university.
Right.
Can you speak a little bit about your thinking then?
Yeah, well, I think when I first went to AT&T, I did that instead of going to academic positions because I wanted to change areas into networking and I wanted to really focus just on the research. But the longer I spent at AT&T, the more I was enjoying, working with interns in the summer, writing survey papers, giving tutorials. I was creating these sort of aspects of an academic life that were not built into the job. I was sort of adding them on top of the job, and there was an epiphany of sorts, like, oh, there's a place where this is just what you do, a mix of research and teaching and mentoring. I know it sounds kind of dumb, but it kind of did sort of just hit me. And the second was I was starting to feel like I was doing a lot of research, reacting to the protocols we have today. And then the pre-SDN work was just happening right as I was about to leave. I was starting to think, God, I really would like to just actually redesign these things to make sense in the first place. And it's like, oh, this would actually be an interesting pivot for me that I'm already starting to make that would rely a little less on day-to-day access to network administrators, still informed by the things they were struggling with. I thought, okay, I can still be productive in doing the kind of applied work I want to do, and I don't necessarily have to be at AT&T to be able to do it. Even though I still strive to find those kinds of relationships with practitioners, I felt like I could still kind of make progress without having it right across the hall, if you will.
Cool. Um, you touched on this a little bit in talking about the traffic engineering work and the Bellhead, the Bell Journal and stuff. One thing I've always admired about sort of vibrant intellectual fields is they represent a range of methods. So you'll have practitioners who are, sort of solving, out there solving problems, pushing the boundary of what's possible with engineering. And then you have theoreticians who are trying to explain, why does this work and how does it generalize? And ideally, they're actually talking to each other. So like, I think it's fair to say you're not a theorist by training, but you've
Yeah.
actually used a lot of theory in your work, often collaborate with theoreticians and, when appropriate, kind of, borrowed ideas out of the theory
Indeed.
literature. Um, so, you have an appreciation for theory, but I'm curious, do you think there's like misunderstandings maybe between these sort of two poles in networking, or ways that they could be more synergistic?
Yeah, well, I think there's a steep learning curve on both sides, right? So I think networking is driven with a lot of domain details that make it very inaccessible to a theorist who's looking for a kind of well-defined, crisp problem statement. And frankly, in our papers as networking people, we sometimes are a little less rigorous than we could be in exactly stating what problem we're solving. That's sort of something we could all be a little better at, myself included. And I think often the reverse is true. The theorists are looking for something where there's going to be a bit of an intellectually hard problem. And the bottom line is sometimes the practical problem, once you've got it sharply formulated, the theoretical work might not be groundbreaking. I mean, it might not be obvious to me what the right hammer it is to use, but to a theoretician, it might be like, oh, this is pull this off the shelf. This is your thing. So I do think there are kind of gaps in taste and gaps in what people value in the work that they do. So those require some overcoming. And sometimes you need a translator, and that's I think the role I've often played in projects is being a translator between the practical problem and the theory, because it's not often the case that the practitioner themselves is going to be the one that can have that conversation directly with the theorist. I think the other thing that's hard in networking, I'm sure you've experienced this too, is that the areas of theory that are appropriate to networking are just humongous. I mean, there's so many, right? PL and verification, optimization, algorithms, statistics, machine learning, there's a whole bunch of them. And nobody's going to be an expert in at most maybe one or two of those things. So it's very difficult to be a networking person and have a full slate of hammers as well as a full set of domain knowledge. One thing I think has been helpful with SDN and getting more people into this space is the abstractions that the data plane provides are well described and relatively simple. And I think that's been a gateway drug for people that might not have collaborated with networking people on other problems that were more messy.
Yeah, I mean, there's people who do kind of straddle both sides. People like Michael Mitzenmacher,
Yeah,
people working on sketching and compact data structures. That stuff is very relevant and cool. And more generally, people thinking about graph problems, Harold Rinka, and so on. So I think networks are cool because they have all these mathematical structures that in some cases have been intensely studied for decades or centuries by mathematicians.
yeah,
But they're also like centrally, involved in the operation of this giant worldwide system. And so yeah, I think it's a field that's kind of uniquely well suited to have both sides represented.
yeah.
But
And I think it's a field, networking is also a field that started out, and I don't want to say anti-intellectual, but reacting against the phone network where everything had to be sort of central, had to be managed with quality of service guarantees and resource reservation. There's sort of a mathematical starting point for the telephony network. And I think in some ways, the early days of the internet was a reaction against that. And so I think there was a natural reluctance to have theory be the driver at the beginning, and correctly so, I think, because a lot of those theoretical techniques that applied to circuit switching didn't apply readily or at all in some
yeah,
cases to packet switching. So we started out without a lot of mathematical underpinnings that we desperately need, actually. And they need to be new mathematical underpinnings than the ones that were in the telephony networks. I think now networks are so mission critical, we can't afford to do networking in a sort of ad hoc way. And so we've had to kind of bring all these methods. That's one of the reasons I like to work with theorists. I feel like the network, we have to grow up and make the network worthy of the trust we increasingly placed in it. And that means we need rigor that we don't always have as a starting point.
yeah, I don't mean to make this a theory love fest. I mean, of course, I love theory when it's appropriate, but I think also one thing I really love about networking is the groundedness, the kind of, the connection to operators,
Yeah,
the pragmatism that, we're not going to go do theory for its own sake or do something complicated because we need to run this thing and it needs to be simple and work.
yeah,
So I think that's one of the things I actually like about this balance is that it's not going to go off and kind of go into some super abstract, investigation. It's going to be connected to practice in a way that's really lovely.
indeed.
Um, so I want to maybe like shift topics again. So I know you're spending all your time in Nassau Hall, running university and navigating the current situation. And it's always hard to make predictions. But another thing I love about networking is that there have been these really revolutionary ideas. And sometimes in hindsight, they look obvious, everything from packet switching to the internet to SDN. But
Mhm.
really at the time, they were not, they were controversial. And if you look ahead now, do you see things that feel like they might be either big new challenges or big new directions that might emerge for the field?
Yeah, I mean, I think every time there's a new network medium or new network access technology, we end up having a whole set of new challenges to work on. And so I think cellular networks, satellite networks, I mean, they're not brand new, but they're becoming more and more dominant ways that people connect to the internet, and they're just fundamentally different than the ways that a lot of earlier networking technologies worked. They're also very complicated, and standards are complicated, and they have a lot of vendor lock-in, a lot of the same problems we used to see on the internet writ large. And so I think those are spaces that there's still a window to get our foot in the door, to get in and make those more open, more natural fits with the internet, better designs that are responsive to the quirks of the medium, if you will. But they're going to be hard ones for us to really break into, both because of the learning curve and because of the entrenched industry involvement that's in them already. But I think those are exciting areas and timely ones. If I had more time for research, that's where I'd be spending more of my time for sure. I think the second is just the set of applications that are becoming more prevalent, and particularly the interactive applications. Video conferencing, is a simple example, but 360 video and all sorts of things that people are doing now with multimedia applications that are incredibly complicated. It's not a single connection. It's not a TCP connection in the first place. It's not a single one. And so being able to reason about the network at the network level, about how these applications behave and how to make them perform better, I think is a hugely exciting area too, particularly
Uh,
over those media that are poorly suited to supporting them.
it's I find it crazy. I mean, I remember when I was in middle school, my dad was doing a lot of work in China. He was living in China at the time, and it was so amazing for me to be able to connect over just when the internet kind of went commercial, on a Unix talk terminal to my dad in China. That was like crazy. But it was, typing chat messages to him over a modem. And and you kind of think like, okay, we're fully connected now. I can watch video or FaceTime with my friends anywhere in the world. But there's still these like, next levels of, satellites and cellular and more devices and then, richer forms of data and interaction. Anyways, you kind of feel like you've climbed the mountain, but there's another peak behind you.
Exactly.
And again, yeah, these things change and networking then responds with a bunch of new problems.
Yeah, I would add also that I think that we have a lot of heterogeneous devices in the network. I mean, some of them are because of differences in access technology. Some of them are network interface cards or software switches or programmable hardware switches. And we're reasonably good now at doing research on a single device or a distributed set of devices that are homogeneous. We aren't really good at being able to write, let's say an SDN program and compile it to a distributed set of heterogeneous devices. And so I think being able to reason about distributed heterogeneous devices is something I think we still don't have quite the right abstractions and tools for doing that kind of work.
I have to ask the obvious question at this point. So, ML is having a huge impact on society, but especially computing.
Yeah,
And if I think about the challenge you just articulated of there's all this heterogeneity, it's a big distributed system. We need to somehow manage this complexity if we want to do
yeah,
something with the network. It seems like there's one sort of classic set of techniques, which is, you know, raise the level of abstraction, come up with systems or languages and have compilers and runtimes that implement those, and then you can work, at a more human level. The other big lever seems to be, LLMs. And I say that flippantly, but like I think it's not unserious. So do you have thoughts on kind of the ML wave and how like what areas of networking is it really going to help with, and what areas maybe is it not just going to be riding the hype wave?
yeah. I mean, I think a lot of networking, particularly a lot of network management and protocols, are measuring and analyzing data. Whether you're a network administrator or it's an intrusion detection system, or even TCP itself, right? TCP itself is trying to learn network conditions and adapt to them. So I do think there's a particular place for ML in the sort of going from raw data to insight, particularly if we can find good ways to codify the things that we know are constraints, speed of light, or the way protocols are defined and behave, that we can use to avoid ML having to learn the things we already know, or to risk learning the wrong thing when we know those things can't be true. And so I do think there's some exciting opportunities to bring networking domain knowledge together with the natural structures that we have into ways that constrain the way that learning algorithms work. And then we've got a whole space of fun things to do around running learning algorithms on resource constrained devices, high speed switches with insufficient memory and computational resources. So I think a lot of these algorithms don't work out of the box in our settings, either because they don't incorporate what we know about networking, or they're too resource intensive. And so I do think there's an exciting space of work to do in adapting these algorithms to work in those settings.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Um, we're a little short on time, so I want to keep moving. I want to ask a negative question. When you're a researcher, I think one of the hardest things to do, maybe besides giving yourself space to go invest in a new area, is deciding to stop working on a problem. You got a sequence of papers. You're the world expert. You can see the next end things to do. How do you decide when it's time to, move on, do something else? How do you
Yeah.
do that transition?
Great question. I mean, one thing is helpful in being an academic is that when you have a new student join your group, that's a great opportunity, and you think, okay, this student is going to graduate in 5 years, and if their PhD is on this topic, like it's going to be rough sledding, right? Because they're going to be trimming the hedges rather than whacking with a machete. And so I think that's one of the things I love about being in an academic environment, right? This sort of constant stream of new people, and also the students have ideas about what they want to work on, and they may be bored too by the thing that's been going on for a long time. So I think fresh faces are a big piece of it, and sometimes you just get bored yourself. I mean, I started learning about cellular networks during COVID because I was bored. Uh, and I was sitting at home really bored. I was a department chair, and I had a 1-year-old, or not a 1-year-old, 5-year-old at the time. So it was not exactly a time to try to start switching research areas, but I was just so profoundly bored that I had to start learning something new. So I think one's own boredom and the fresh face in the room kind of tell you a bit of when it's time.
Yeah, I totally agree about students. I mean, the new students bring so much energy and enthusiasm. It's hard not to build off that, and it's a great opportunity to think about new directions.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done any work on machine learning, except I have an undergrad, a senior working with me on a project to understand Chat GPT workloads. And at first, she wanted to work on that, and I was like, oh, I was trying to, like, okay, let's do algorithms in P4 for this next telemetry problem. Yeah, not so much. Like, okay, so now I've been learning about the workloads that these chatbots put on the network, and it's been fun.
Cool. So I want to close with a last question. This video will be part of Nines, this new audacious experiment that some of us are trying to set up a totally new conference, hopefully top tier, great work, but really centered on new ideas. What value do you see in this kind of venue, especially maybe for students and younger researchers?
Yeah, I mean, stepping back, I just think it's great that we have a portfolio of venues, because it's great to have places for each of these different kinds of work that are all important. And I think also networking, as we were just discussing, there's so many new directions we can go in, and if there isn't a place for people to go with those ideas that are maybe fleshed out still, but not in the mainstream, that it's great to have a place to go. And there are places like hotnets, which is really valuable too, but then you only have the beginnings of an idea, you haven't evaluated it yet. So I think having a place for that first set of papers in a new area where they're fleshed out enough where they can be truly evaluated, and yet there's a place for them where there's receptivity to those kinds of ideas, I think can be a really exciting combination of mature enough work and yet provocative enough work. That having venues like that, like Nines, I think is hugely important for helping us jump out of sort of what is it, local minima, if you will.
Great. Well, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun. It's always fun to talk to you, and hope that we can do it again sometime soon.
Awesome. Thanks. I enjoyed it.